So, hello everybody, and we're back here again for now the Have Your Say session. So, I can see already that a lot of you are requesting to come and be part of the discussions. There's obviously lots of things to cover. So, first of all, I would like to say a warm welcome back to Richard, and a warm welcome for the first time to Amit. So, Amit and Richard are going to be our co-moderators for this session. So, guys, I will leave it to you, and we've got a lot of people lined up. So in a couple of seconds, I'm going to start bringing people up, and looking forward to hearing what everyone's thoughts are on the session. So over to you guys.
Sure. I guess I've had a good say this afternoon, Amit. I don't know if you want to comment on your thoughts of what we've heard so far.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very interesting session. Well done, Richard. A good discussion there. I suppose a couple of things struck me kind of sitting back a little bit. And the first one was essentially probably now is actually quite a good time to take this sort of longer term look, take this longer term view. I was thinking, we've had a WRC last year, so we're now looking forward to WRC 23. We've got a new commission in place, so we've got a new sort of regulatory period, if you like, coming up. And of course, as you discussed in the session, COVID sort of provides a time to, first of all, learn lessons from it. But also, I think it's given people time to just step back and think a little bit. So, it probably is a good time to be thinking a little bit further ahead. I suppose the other thing I thought of is what always happens in these sorts of policy programs and the likes, and even the Spectrum Conference, is often there's a comment, is there too much on mobile? Is mobile dominating this? And I think partially that's inevitable because that is, a lot of the new innovation is coming in mobile, and as I think we saw in the poll, 31% of people thought that would be a key part of the RSPP. But I think all of us would agree that it can't just be about mobile. And Andreas, one of the first things I think he said was the RSPP is not going to just be about 5G. So I think what I'm hoping this session will do is actually bring out some of the different views of different communities and different stakeholders in the spectrum area. So I think that'll be very interesting. And one final point, just to follow up on the discussion you just had in the last session about the verticals and private networks and the likes of, do they need spectrum or do they need connectivity? One of the things that was sort of raging in the chat function while you were having that session was a little bit of a debate of should you, is it fair for verticals to be put up against mobile operators to compete for spectrum in auctions? And some very, very differing views on that. So maybe some of that will also come out in this.
Thank you, Amit. That's absolutely fascinating. So we've a number of people lined up, desperate to contribute to the session. I'm going to take them in the order. Well, I'm not sure who's meant to go first. Wave your hand if you think it's you. I guess, Torsten, you were up first in terms of screen. So let's hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. And yeah, it was really an excellent panel. From my perspective, what I can see throughout the crisis, or still, the 5G rollout globally is still a success story. Because as we are speaking here today, we have more than 60 commercial networks launched in more than 30 countries globally. And as Qualcomm, we see as well that we have currently 375 designs which are using our technology, which has been already launched or are about to launch. So we see it's a big success story. What we see as well is still the US is ahead of the pack in terms of 5G deployment. We see, of course, a strong interest in China. More than 40% of the devices which are sold in China nowadays are already 5G devices. And in Europe, we see as well a quite satisfying development. So, of course, there was a delay in the auctions in several countries, France, Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, for instance. But I think now, after 3 months or so, which is the time of the delay, things will be on track. I remember Jonas last time at our last conference, he mentioned it's not the time for sophisticated license terms in order to ensure that we will have the rollout. I could not agree more. So I see, especially taking into consideration that we are in the delay in Europe already, it is really time to get the spectrum out as soon as possible. What was very interesting to me was that the poll brought the results that the speed, the broadband speed is of utmost importance. And this brings me to my next point. We think as Qualcomm that 5G can raise its full potential only in the interplay of the various spectrum bands, including millimeter wave. Especially if you take into consideration that 80% of the mobile traffic is generated indoors. And this means that there's really time to have millimeter wave. Currently, or here as well, the US is ahead. We see as well that Korea, Japan, Russia are about to start a millimeter wave. And we see as well in Europe that, for instance, in Italy, we will have first launches of millimeter waves. Germany will release spectrum soon, and Finland is considering this. And in the UK, we have tests as well. So there is some room for millimeter wave already in Europe, but we think as Qualcomm that there is a little bit more room for improvement in this regard. And this is really something, especially if we take into consideration, well, the speed Justin Ookla study brought that 5G in the mid-band is 4 times faster than LTE, and millimeter wave is 5 times faster than the mid-band 5G. So this means it's 20 times LTE. And if broadband speed is that important, you will only get this with millimeter wave. And of course, if we talk about verticals, if we talk about MNOs, well, especially in campus solutions, where you are maybe dependent in an industrial environment on very, very fast latency times, there's no way to avoid millimeter wave in the long run. If you're interested in this, so there will be a showcase session from my colleague John Smee afterwards, who will show how we deploy or how we bring 5G into a campus environment and how we think the evolution of 5G will be. This is on stage 1 after this Have Your Say session. Yeah, so these were my initial words. Thanks.
Fascinating. Okay, yeah, speed obviously coming up as a critical issue, but also coverage and reliability as well. Next up, we have Kumar.
Hi, good afternoon, Richard. Good afternoon, everybody. So just a quick 1 minute about myself. I've been working for 30 plus years in the space industry, and I've had fun across the table with many of my friends in the mobile industry. I still work for a space company, but it has got relatively little spectrum interests. For my sins, I chair 2 groups in the UK, which is a Brexiting country. So thank you very much to everybody for accommodating input from the UK company. But the 2 roles I have is I chair the Satellite Telecommunications Committee, which is a joint committee of UK Space, which is the Space Trade Association, and Tech UK, which is the biggest ICT body in the UK. So it's an interesting job. And somewhat to my surprise, I was recently elected to be chair of the International Spectrum Group of so-called Cluster 4 of the UK Spectrum Policy Forum, which is a cross-industry body. So I'm going to phrase my questions in a way where I have the least risk of being bashed on the head by my colleagues in my committees. So I have basically 2 main questions which would actually be interesting to raise. Andreas mentioned in his presentation earlier that about 12 gigahertz of spectrum is likely or is intended to be identified for future wireless access below 100 gigahertz. And I'd be interested in the thoughts of those on this panel and indeed others as to where that spectrum is likely to come from. Is it, for example, going to be above 30 gigahertz, or is it going to be below 30 gigahertz, or in some combination, or in some weighting? And wherever it is, there would be an implied degree of additional sharing considerations with other services. And the second question is related to making more millimeter wave spectrum available for 5G or indeed 6G. And the WRC, which just concluded, identified bands at, say, above 37.5 gigahertz and above. Do you think it would be appropriate for the European Commission and the RSC to take steps to start to go for harmonization decisions in those bands with a view to faster tracking entry of 5G into those bands under TBD conditions? That's it from me.
Okay.
Interesting. Johan, sorry. You're next up, I believe.
Yes. Hi, it's Joanne LeMay, co-president of LYA, and I invite you all to go and visit our exhibit booth and participate, look at our showcase later this week on Friday. So I much enjoyed this session. I think that was quite interesting and engaging. And I just wanted to touch base on comment, maybe that Gilles made, that there's maybe a diminishing demand for millimeter wave spectrum as they see in Europe. And I guess that builds on some of the comments that Torsten made, where he says, no, there's need to accelerate. So recently, as you know, the US has taken a totally different approach to 5G in a sense because they didn't have much choice, but that's also what they did. There's a lot of spectrum in millimeter wave that's been awarded. It's been deployed. Verizon clocks in at 500 megabit per second on tests from OpenSignal in terms of 5G, but very, very low speed. Now, there's also a view that there might be an impact of COVID on how you should allocate or deploy 5G spectrum, because obviously they've deployed this millimeter wave in large venues, downtown cores. You don't have coverage, and now nobody's there, and they may not be there for the next 6 to 1 year. So does that call into question a focus on millimeter wave? And I'm not saying that it should, but I think it's a question. Does COVID have actually an impact and bring a stronger focus on mid-band 3.4, 3.8, which Europe is an advantage, and also 700 megahertz, which has not yet been concluded in many countries. So that's the type of question I'd like to hear feedback on.
I think Gilles Bregon was also sort of hinting at that in his remarks, stepping back and
yes.
looking at what to do about millimeter wave. So yeah, I think we're interested to hear what the audience think.
Yes.
And also, of course, considering the fact that there may be other solutions that aren't just mobile, which could provide some of the coverage in areas where there isn't much at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel from the GSMA, I guess you're up next.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. So this was actually quite an excellent panel, and the speech by the commissioner was particularly interesting because he hit the nail exactly on the head on some of, I think, the core issues that Europe will have to grapple with as it readies for massive 5G deployment. And in particular, he talked about awards and ensuring that the conditions are favorable to investment. And what was interesting to sort of think about maybe is the fact that we're starting to come back kind of full circle. And what I mean by that is we're having awards that end up being very costly with conditions that at times questionable. And then once those governments receive the proceeds, then they scramble to find ways to return it to the sector and the industry. And we've seen this in a number of cases where governments in Europe, and I'm not going to name and shame here, have actually decided to help the industry by providing funds to help out with deployment, with coverage in less attractive areas, and so on. And so from that perspective, I think we really need to start thinking about what the conditions for those awards are and what the impact will be of these awards in the longer term, because at the moment we're looking at awarding pioneer bands. So the C-band, the 26, and the 700, of course, as well. So we really need to think very, very carefully about how that is brought to the market, because the impact will be not for 5 or 10 years, but maybe longer. So that's one point. The other one that I think is really worth thinking about, and big kudos goes to the European Commission, and in particular, Andreas Branimir and Christos, who worked on the Small Cell Implementing Act, is that although it will be very helpful for the industry in order to deploy 5G, it's not the silver bullet that will solve the deployment challenge. The reality is that you will need to also start looking at macro sites and how those are licensed and the amount of time it takes to actually put those out. Because from an operator's perspective, if you have a macro site, inherently you get to reuse all of your other frequencies. You can put multiple antennas, and obviously that helps you with backhaul. And so from that perspective, the review of the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, I think, will be absolutely critical to ensure that we have that sort of coverage and capacity that's added with 5G. And I laughed a little bit, and this is the third point I really wanted to make, when Jonas talked about the greatest hits of the RSPP, about the 800, about the 1,200 megahertz for mobile. And that's true, there were great hits, but the reality is, for those of you who have had the opportunity to reread the RSPP, it's fantastic, actually, articles and recitals. you'll realize that that was a document worked on and published 10 years ago. And it has provisions that we now see almost being copied within the communications code. And that begs the question of, if that document was so good on policy, how come it didn't have the impact that now we're trying to have with the code and that now we'll revise again? So I think whilst looking forward as to how we need to change it and the things we'll need to include from the policy side, I think we need to start asking ourselves the question for a moment is, what actually went wrong? Why didn't we have those positive results that the RSPP tried to have on the policy elements? Because they talk about awards, they talk about coordination, they talk about amazingly pragmatic things that actually we're still talking today. And so although they were good hits, in some respects, I think there's many elements that we need to also take a moment to just consider and see how we failed and how we need to change sooner, hopefully, rather than later.
Thanks, Daniel. I mean, I do wonder, just taking your last point, if the communications code was the implementation mechanism for some of those things that was raised. I mean, the RSPP is a plan, it still needs implementation legislation, and the code was the way of doing some of those. But yeah, we'll see what others think. I think in the interest of time, let's move on. Chris, do you want to go next?
Thanks very much, Amit, and good afternoon, everyone. And actually, I mean, very much reflecting on that, and I think reflection on Jonas's last comment as well, actually. I mean, I would agree with you, Amit. I think, as Jonas said, the role of the RSPP is to set direction. I think, actually, if it tries to be overly prescriptive and provide all the solutions, then there's a real danger that it would go wrong. And I think that's where the success of the RSPP was last time around. And I think we heard some really good things from the panel, actually, and a lot that I would agree with. I could go through all the things I agree with, but that would be a little bit boring. So if I was to offer one challenge, I think, based on what I've heard, is that I think sometimes we have a tendency to look at the future through the lens of what we've done in the past. And actually, I think at the moment, we are going through a stage of flux, possibly because of things like COVID, but also just because of the state of the economy, because of the desire for connectivity. I mean, we heard from Gilles about the newcomers coming in relation to 5G and the verticals. There is innovation everywhere. It's not just 5G, it's in satellite, in NGSO, in Wi-Fi, in IoT, in all sorts of sectors. We are seeing incredible innovation. We're also seeing technical advancement in terms of how we use spectrum and the potential that's creating for things like spectrum sharing, and also protecting incumbents at the same time. And also the use of frequency bands that, quite frankly, we never thought we'd be using for connectivity just a few years ago. And again, that is offering scope for thinking about how we might do things a little bit differently. So in terms of what that actually means, in terms of new approaches, I mean, I think we really should put innovation. I'd quite like to have heard a little bit more about innovation, I think, from the panel. I mean, we heard newcomers from Gilles, but it is about trying to promote innovation, I think, if Europe is to be successful going forward. It's about making spectrum available to support that innovation, and that means making spectrum available when and where it's needed. Now, sometimes that will be national licenses, as we've tended to do in the past quite often, but sometimes it'll be more local licenses. And it might well vary from case to case, from country to country. I think it's also about thinking about what's the right approach to harmonization. I mean, harmonization is great, and I'm certainly not knocking it. I mean, and we'll continue to need to harmonize. But as Gilles mentioned, there is a question about the demand for some of the millimeter wave band. And actually, I think we need to think maybe potentially a little bit differently about how we harmonize where there's that uncertainty. And then finally, I think it's also about changing the mindset of users. And you know, I think users are going to have to understand in future that, you know, spectrum is something that is shared between different types of user. And we need to get people to think, and regulators to think for that matter, that that's the way we should move forward. And in particular, I mean, Kumar asked earlier where all this spectrum is going to come from. Well, I think it's going to come from a different approach to how we use spectrum, and much more spectrum sharing and working together to ensure that we're using the resources best we can.
Good points, Chris. I think one of the things that struck me from what you said was, you know, the need to be sort of thinking ahead rather than looking in the rearview mirror. And, you know, going back to the poll in the previous session about what were the issues from COVID, and the low latency in the machine-to-machine scoring so low. I mean, my immediate thought there was probably that's because the applications and the uses that need all that don't exist. Now, maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they may be absolutely critical to us in our lives, and we may have a very different poll response then. So, I don't think we should just dismiss those as not being important just because they didn't appear in a poll today, if you like. So
I completely agree, and I think it would be really sort of wrong and potentially dangerous to try and answer that question now. And that's why I think, the RSPP is about setting the direction. It's about providing flexibility. It's about making spectrum available, and then we'll see what happens. But if we try to determine what those future use cases are, as we always say, we'll probably just get it wrong.
Indeed. Dave, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I just have one observation based on what Chris was saying, really. I'm currently working on a 5G testbed and trial project for the UK government in a rural area. And I was struck by the comment, sometimes there's a tendency to look at the future based on the past. What I wanted to say is, here's a real case example I can give you from the farming community. I'll cite Wales, but I could cite any of the UK's nations. Typical farming income, £16,500. Average age of a farmer in excess of 60. Numbers of suicides a week, at least one. We're expecting a bunch of people who have a real need for uses and a real need to produce food, and it's of importance to all of us to utilise spectrum resources with having very little idea and in often cases very little interest in how the finer points of this all works. But one thing I did notice, we were discussing, for example, high quality imagery from drones flown remotely within line of sight over a very limited area. And one of the things came back to the weather. It's something I'd never considered. What happens is if you're setting up all your gizmos to go out and spray your crops and actually crack on with the work, if you detect areas of the field which are in need of that treatment, you've got a real problem. You want to do it there and then, because the chances are the longer you leave it, the worse it gets. And in the UK in particular, but certainly in many other places, if it rains, you've lost that time and more damage is done. And one of the things that the farmer said to us is we actually need very high capacity bi-directional services because we want to crack on with this and we need it in real time, and we want to process it in real time, and we want to have our agricultural machinery out in that field in hours. So to Chris's point again, maybe what we should be thinking about is millimetric and the smart fence post, because I'm not convinced, whilst everyone else is telling me how important lower band stuff is in the rural communities. Yes, of course it is, but there are definitely applications, and again, coming back to Joanne's point, where there is a change going on here. COVID has brought about some impact, and we might be thinking about millimetric in fields. I never thought I'd hear myself say that. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, millimetre wave in fields. It's not where we expected it to be deployed. That's certainly the case. I'm just wondering, there's no one else has popped up on here, so maybe that's a topic that we could pick up on, not strictly millimetre wave in fields, but the millimetre wave topic comes up time and again. And as it stands at the moment, the licensing for that is being done along the lines of traditional mobile licensing. So, you have a license awarded through an auction to a limited number of parties, and yet here we are saying, actually, first of all, there was a comment made earlier that we can share the spectrum. It's perfect for sharing. It doesn't go very far. And now we're saying actually it's needed for verticals in all manner of applications. So are we looking at it the right way, or should we actually be looking at millimetre wave completely differently as more of a kind of Wi-Fi approach?
Do you want me to have a stab at that?
Anybody can have a stab at that.
Well, let someone else have a stab first. I have a view, but I'd rather hear their views.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, maybe I take it. Well, you're right. So we have a different concept if it comes to millimeter wave, and most of the regulators are looking in a kind of application procedures that simply as a vertical or any kind of MNO can apply for spectrum for a certain range as soon as he can demonstrate that he has a legitimate interest. And then if you see, if you look at countries like Germany, they have a little bit a different system, because at least in their initial thinking, they wanted to block 100 megahertz at 27.5 to 28.5 for verticals only. But frankly speaking, this could lead to a situation that spectrum will not really be used. especially if maybe not everybody is able really to, we had this already, to manage the spectrum, to really to make use of the spectrum, and to overcome the technical expertise and hurdles which come with the operation of a network or whatsoever. So therefore, what we are thinking is a first come, first serve principle or system in which verticals as well as MNOs can apply for spectrum for certain use cases. We think this is the best balance, right? So to make it available, at least in theory, for everybody, to ensure on the other side that MNOs will block it nationwide, but by nature, usually if it comes to millimeter wave, this risk is limited. So this is what we think as Qualcomm would be desirable for millimeter wave. Yeah.
Did you want to come in then?
Okay, I'll add a little bit. I just think that it's always valuable to actually go out and ask people what they want. We spend a lot of our time postulating what use cases might be out there, how we might commercialize it. And the one thing, as Chris said earlier, that we've always got wrong is exactly what the real people really want on the ground. If I'm a farmer and I'm spending or being asked to spend, even on the cheapest Ofcom licenses, over a 25th of my total annual income just to get hold of some spectrum, which even if I did have, I probably wouldn't know how to use. Would I go perhaps to my local agricultural cooperative? Would I go to my local council? Well, I might go to my local council. And then that begs all kinds of other questions about, are they the right people to run networks? Should this be something that they do? How does this help with the rural economy? My instincts are that Ofcom, in particular in the UK, has shown a great deal of flexibility. My only gripe is around mid-band stuff, where as a former employee of a major handset manufacturer, I understand the difficulties of trying to get the mass market ecosystem up and running. And sometimes in certain bands, it's harder to make something work than others. The brutal truth is this: 1, the farmers can't afford it. 2, there's a genuine use case. And therefore, 3, the notion of auctioning all of that stuff off for some of those areas has not met the needs of the final 20% in the UK, and I doubt it has anywhere else. Back to you, Richard.
I noticed Joanne raised a finger there. I think you had a comment as well.
Yes, well, I just want, to touch base on a number of subjects that were covered, like the spectrum needs for vertical, millimeter wave in the fields, and all of those things. I think there was a mention of a spectrum operator, or that maybe some MNOs could be spectrum operators. I think that's, or I know in the past we've looked at having like spectrum exchange companies, like brokers, or I guess something more automated than that. And I was wondering if you could see that as a solution in the case of millimeter wave, for example, where there's a lot of spectrum, maybe it's not getting used all the time, but you could have, is this a new business model that could come about? That's a spectrum wholesaler or spectrum operator. I think there might be something of interest to that. And not having MNOs always act as gatekeepers to innovation, because, obviously they want to keep their pricing structure for services and all of that. So that's a question maybe some others would like to touch base on or to comment on.
Chris, did you have your hand up earlier when Dave was speaking? Or?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that I think it's really difficult to answer this question at the current time. I just don't think we know. Indeed, I mean, when the session was on earlier, actually, I think it was when Stefan was speaking, there was quite an interesting dialogue in the chat about whether or not Finland or Germany had got the right answer, because they'd taken slightly different approaches to how they'd awarded the C-band spectrum. And the short answer is, I'm not sure that we know. And I think, I guess my main point is that I think it would be the wrong thing to do, or the one thing we shouldn't do, is to try and think that we know the right answer at this stage, and this is what the future is going to look like. I mean, certainly from a UK perspective, we've tried to make a load of spectrum available for verticals in both sort of C-band, which is 3.8 to 4.2 in the UK, and in the millimeter wave band between 24.25 to 26.5. And it's there if people want to use it. I mean, it's much more on a sort of almost I won't say experimental basis, but it's there really to promote innovation, because we don't quite know what those uses are going to be. We don't know whether it's going to be farmers in fields using millimeter wave, which is something we hadn't considered previously, but maybe, but there's no reason why we should know the answer to all of that. So I think it's just about, trying to facilitate, but not preempt.
Okay, we had Martin popping up earlier, but he's disappeared. I don't know if that was accidental or he's lost his connection. But if he pops back up, if you're still there, want to speak, we can pop back up and we'll give you a chance. Daniel, do you want to say something there?
Yes, I was actually very, very interested to hear what everyone would say with regards to this. So obviously, being from the mobile industry, we have been thinking a lot what to do with this ban. And you're right, Finland, Germany have taken very, very, very different approaches to it. And I actually, I sympathize with the comment that Chris made, that we're not entirely sure in which direction this will go. And the fact is that when we talk about the vertical needs, those inevitably will have to be accommodated. But one thing that I really liked that Gilles said earlier, which is bear in mind, spectrum is very technical. That you may be able to do it yourself if you're big enough and you have the expertise, or you may not. And I think one of the things we haven't really talked about is the complexity of using TDD spectrum and the need to synchronize. So say the German case, you have reservations in the band for verticals, and they apply for these local licenses to have their campus covered and to be able to have that kind of 5G connectivity. The fact is, you will need to synchronize with mobile networks, which means that your frame structure will have to be defined, right? And then there will also be synchronization issues along borders, and we haven't started talking about that. Not to mention that if you don't synchronize, which you may not want to do because you want a different frame structure, then you will have to have either guard bands or exclusion zones, right? So huge distances that we're talking about here. And that will be an issue, because then how do you cover those areas? Then are you wasting spectrum or not? And I think we're underestimating significantly these technical elements, because contrary to other regions in the world, Europe doesn't really have experience with TDD spectrum. Most of it has been FDD for the moment, right? And I think this technical element will have to be resolved. Otherwise, it's going to be just very complex environment. And in that perspective, I think Finland has taken the right approach. And I think we've used Finland as a best example with regards to the C-band in actually having license obligations within the C-band licenses, that if the mobile industry isn't very keen to provide connectivity for verticals, then they would have to sublease it to them. So that's, I think, a very pragmatic way to deal with the vertical demand. Now, for the 26, obviously the situation is very different, and Italy also has awarded the band in their club use model. Finland just did a couple of weeks ago as well, where 800 was given to the mobile industry, whilst the lower 850 would be reserved for local area use. And that is also quite a pragmatic way of dealing with this, because you would need still a significant chunk of that spectrum to be able to provide those services for public use and mobile networks if you want to achieve any of those speeds that we're advertising and those capabilities. Anything short of that, and I think we will under.
Daniel, I think we're starting to run out. I mean, I would like. Yeah. We've had two speakers who waited, so Martin and
absolutely.
If you're still there, go ahead. But Martin, go ahead quickly.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd just like to make the point that for the past quarter century at least, economists have been telling us consistently that the best way to license spectrum is via auctions, because that way you identify who values the spectrum the highest. However, it's not necessarily the case that the people who value the spectrum the highest may be doing so for motivations that are consistent with those of public policy. And I would argue that in some cases, not all, it's actually better to go back to the old-fashioned way of directly allocating spectrum for people who put forward a good case for using it. And this is something that Hong Kong, for example, decided to do with the 26 gigahertz spectrum. And I'll pick up on that, the difference between millimeter wave and the mid-band. I am aware of work that has been done in Europe looking at some of the issues, very important ones raised, for synchronization frequencies in the C-band, and the kind of geographic or other provisions that you had to put in place to make sure that TDD networks next to each other were not interfering with each other. In the 26 gigahertz band or millimeter wave band, the problem should be much less. So I would urge that, particularly when thinking about millimeter wave bands, we think about direct or administrative allocations and not get caught up in the idea that everything that has to be done for allocating spectrum has to be done through auctions. Finland's done fairly well, I think, because they have a very low spectrum-free price with auctions. But of course, the other way to have a low spectrum-free price is to allocate it directly in a sensible way. So I think that's something that should be in the toolbox for regulators to consider.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. I suppose I would sum up by saying that I think there's a lot of things to think about going into the sort of next RSPP. And I think picking up on one of Chris's points, I think it'll be good to see a lot of innovation in there. You know, we've talked a lot about, for example, more ways of spectrum sharing, but I sense North America is starting to run ahead. You know, for example, their plans for the CBRS spectrum, you know, some more dynamic approaches. And I think it's very important for Europe to keep up that innovation, keep up with all that innovation. So I hope we'll see some of those innovative techniques being considered as part of the next RSPP. Okay, thank you very much to everyone for their contributions. And Dan, back over to you.